AnamCara is a word that translates soul friend, and it is the Celtic version of a spiritual director. When we think about spiritual directors today, we often think about, some people have them. Maybe pastors have a spiritual director, and maybe somebody who's in need for a little while has a spiritual director, but we often don't think about it quite the way the Celts did. They believed that everyone should have a spiritual director. Everyone should have an AnamCara. This was so thoroughly baked into their way of being that when Bridget of Kildare was talking about what it is to have a soul friend, she said, anyone without a soul friend is like a body without a head. I wonder, do you ever feel like faith is kind of hard to navigate alone? Who is your soul friend? Who walks alongside you and encourages you, helping you see God at work in your life? I'm currently taking missions class, and I'll be honest, I was a little resistant to this class. My history in the evangelical church, missions had always been presented as this pushy way of presenting the gospel that just didn't align with my Celtic faith, didn't align with my current church even as a Quaker. The idea of missions sounded so strange to me. And I've been pleasantly surprised. The first book that I picked up was a book called Nudge by Leonard Sweet. And his idea is that missions is noticing and pointing out God at work in someone else's life. And as I sit with that, I'm like, that's spiritual direction. Like, that's mission work? Who knew? Who knew? I'm already doing missions. As a soul friend, my mission field is my friend's narrative. And if I can listen to it, if I can point out where God is already working, that's missions. This is important because soul friends can see things that we can't see. They can say things that others couldn't say. There's an example of this, Columba. He was a fiery and ambitious monk. It's probably worth noting that there's a tradition of Celts being fiery. You've probably heard of the Fighting Irish, and this is a tradition because, Irish folks can be a little fiery. We had a story among the Celts that St. Nicholas was known for beating somebody to death with his crozier when they had a theological disagreement. And so there's this tradition where we recognize, and I certainly saw it in our synods, that there is a lot of opinions and a lot of strong will among the Celtic people. So Columba was one cut from the same cloth. He was fiery and ambitious, and he had one such dispute where we don't know what happened, but it was an exchange that was intense enough that he got exiled from Ireland. And he was in a rough place after it. And he was trying to figure out what his life was about then. And it felt like a punishment that was too big to bear. And how was he to serve God anymore? And his soul friend was able to see something that he could not. St. Comgall was his soul friend, and he encouraged him to, instead of viewing the exile as punishment, to look at it as an opportunity for mission because he was being sent somewhere else. This resonated with Columba in a way that pushed his mission to a new place. He went on to found a monastery on the island of Iona that is still there and still in operation today, and is probably one of the most famous, if not the most famous, Celtic monastery in the world. Iona is the way that the Irish Celts finally reached the Scots, who, in the same way that the Irish seemed unreachable to Palladius, the Celtic people and Patrick seemed unable to reach the Scots. But Iona, Columba, they were able to reach them. We're also moved by our friends. Our friends will move us internally to make decisions that we might not make otherwise. There's an oral story of St. Patrick when he was sharing the gospel with a chief who was particularly hostile to the gospel. It was only after one of the chief's friends stepped forward and said that he was convinced that the chief also was willing to hear and listen to Patrick's word, and Patrick was able to get through to him. Aelred, another Celtic saint, said, "To live without a soul friend is to live like a beast." And this reminds me a little bit of Dr. Bruce Alexander's rat park research. Not sure if you're familiar. He was actually expanding on some previous research that had been done around addiction, where they took a rat, or they took many because it was a research project, but they took rats and they put them in cages and they gave them 2 water bottles. One water bottle was regular water and the other one was water laced with some drug. And they allowed the rats to choose what they would drink. And they found that the rats would drink the drug-laced water, and they would continue to drink that water until they died. And so we had some pretty morbid ideas of addiction that came from this early research. But Dr. Bruce Alexander looked at this and he said, well, wait a minute, though. Rats are social creatures, and you've locked them up in a cage where they have nothing to do and nobody to be with. What if we put them in the same scenario, but they had friends and they had places to be and things to do, and they were able to play? And so he builds what he called Rat Park, where there were lots of other rats and they had toys and they had things that they could do. And it was just this little rat haven. And he did the same thing. He gave them the option of the 2 waters. And in his experiment, he found that the rats would all try the drug-laced water, and they would drink enough of the drug-laced water to get addicted, but then they would lose interest and they would go play with the other rats. And the conclusion that he drew here is that addiction is often a lack of connection. Our rats needed a soul friend, and without a soul friend, they lived like a beast, or it was like a person without a head. Jim Wilder is another researcher who's kind of looked at this, the relationships and importance of friendship and what that means. His research has been interesting in the sense that we often think that our character is developed by willpower. We can decide what we do and will ourselves to do it. But Wilder has pointed out that it's not actually how we change our character, that our subconscious is actually constantly asking the question, what do people like me do in situations like this? And we adapt our behavior to align with however we define our people. With that in mind, how important is it that the people that we define as our people are people that we have really vetted and thought about, people that we want to be like, because our character is developed by the people that we spend our time with. That old phrase that our parents used to tell us about, the effect that the friends that we have will have on us, turns out to be true. So when we think of picking a soul friend, somebody who's not just going to, be our friend and hang out with us, but somebody who's going to care for our soul, how much more important is it that we carefully select that person? Edward Sellner is a Celt who has done some writing on soul friends, and he identified 7 attributes of a good soul friend. The first one is maturity. He said, it's important that you have somebody who is mature, who has lived through life, and not just somebody with opinions. Oftentimes when we're young and loud, we think we know all the things. And so it's easy, especially in our youth, to pick someone to be a soul friend who seems to know it all. But in maturity, we begin to realize how little we actually know. And so maturity is a component that is important to look for in a soul friend. The second one he identified was compassion. We want somebody who can feel our pain, somebody who can relate to and connect with. We want somebody who isn't just rigid with us, but is compassionate and cares for us, wants the best for us, and will be gentle with us when we won't be gentle with ourselves. The third quality was a genuine respect for your story and your process. This is important because sometimes in maturity, we have learned what is successful for us. And we might think that what was successful for us will be successful for another person. And we might start coaching them in that direction. But a soul friend should respect your story and your process, because what works for you might be different than what worked for them. So they need to hold their own experiences loosely in that sense. The next one he identified was confidentiality. You're not really going to share the depths of your heart and be vulnerable with somebody who you don't know and trust 100% sure is going to hold your story as your story and not be trying to share that story with other people as if it was theirs to share. The next one is self-disclosure. I think this one's interesting because it's really where it veers away from, like therapeutic models, for instance. Therapeutic models, they're teaching therapists to not self-disclose because this time is not about them. And it's important that if you have a soul friend that you can still talk with them. Like, you need to be able to be the center of that conversation at times, but also somebody who self-discloses is somebody who's connected with you in a way that allows them to truly care for you and not just see you as a client. And this is where, again, that soul friend model differs from the clinical model of a therapist, or even often modern spiritual direction, which tends to lean a little bit more on the clinical side of non-self-disclosure. A soul friend is somebody who's invested and a co-equal with you in the relationship. And then lifelong learner. You want somebody who's continuing to learn. Once somebody stops learning, they start dying. And so we want our soul friends to be people who are continuing to grow. And then the last one, empathy. This one sounds a lot like compassion, but as he goes on to define this in particular, the difference really is that by empathy, he means the discernment, the ability to notice the movements of your heart. So compassion is somebody that can be gentle with you, and the empathy is somebody who can know what's happening, who can see those fingerprints of God as they move within your inner being. So my challenge for this particular category this week is pray and reflect. Who might God be calling you to walk alongside as a soul friend? If you already have one, reach out and share how they've been a blessing to you. Sometimes we don't acknowledge our soul friends. We don't even recognize that that's what that relationship is. And so maybe you, as you think about it, you reflect and you're like, oh, I've already got one. We just don't call it that. Great. You don't need to call it that, but acknowledge what it is. Call them up. Tell them what a blessing they are to you. Thank them. My invitation to you is to consider also how you could be an AnamCara for someone else. Who needs your encouragement? Who needs your listening ear? Who needs your prayers?